The bones in that grave should not exist, because everything we were taught about who built this empire just fell apart. If this story pulls at something in you, do one small thing for me. Just whisper the name of this empire out loud right now. Say it. Because in a few minutes, you will understand why that word means something completely different than you thought. For centuries, we told one story about the Inca, a story so clean, so simple that nobody questioned it. The story goes like this. A small group of warriors came out of the mountains. They built an empire in 100 years. They had no writing, no wheels, no iron tools. Yet somehow they built cities in the clouds. They ruled millions of people across thousands of miles of land. Then, in a moment of pure historical shock, a tiny group of Spanish soldiers walked in and destroyed it all. That is the story you learned in school. That is the story in documentaries. That is the story in almost every book. It feels dramatic. It feels tragic. It feels complete. But here is the problem. It is not true, not fully, not even close. Because when scientists finally opened up the DNA of Inca remains, bones that had been sitting quietly in the earth for over 500 years, something strange happened. The results did not match the story, not the timeline, not the population numbers, not even the idea of who the Inca actually were as a people. And once that first crack appeared, the whole story started to shake. Let's slow down for a second. Let's go back to the beginning, the way most people understand it. Around the year 1400, a small tribe living near a valley called Cusco began to expand. They fought neighboring groups, they formed alliances. Slowly, methodically, they grew. Within 100 years, this small group controlled an empire stretching along the spine of South America. Mountains, deserts, jungles, coastlines, all of it under one system, one language, one ruling class. They built roads that connected the empire like a nervous system. They built storage systems to prevent famine. They built Machu Picchu, a city so precisely placed in the mountains that modern engineers still study how they did it without modern tools. Then, in 1532, a group of less than 200 Spanish soldiers arrived. Within a few short years, this massive empire collapsed. That contrast, tiny army versus massive empire, is what made the story so powerful. It felt like something impossible had happened. But that is exactly why scientists became suspicious. Because empires do not usually fall that fast, populations do not usually shift that quickly, and civilizations do not usually appear out of nowhere in just one century. So researchers began asking a question that sounds simple but is actually explosive. What if the story we were told was designed to be simple? Not because it was true, but because it was easier to accept. That question is where the real investigation begins. To understand what DNA revealed, you need to understand what scientists were expecting to find. Most historians believe the Inca population was relatively small and genetically uniform, a tight group of people from one region, sharing very similar ancestry, who expanded outward and absorbed neighboring groups through conquest. This matched the old story of a small warrior class ruling over a much larger population of separate ethnic groups. But ancient DNA studies started revealing something different. When scientists analyzed the genetic material from skeletons across the Andes region, spanning different time periods before, during, and after the Inca Empire, they expected to see a clear genetic split. One group before the empire, a different, more dominant genetic signature during Inca rule, then a shift again after Spanish colonization. Instead, they found something far more complicated. The genetic diversity across Andean populations was much older, much deeper, and much more mixed than expected. Some populations that were assumed to be conquered outsiders actually showed genetic continuity going back thousands of years before the Inca even existed. In other words, the Inca were not one single bloodline that took over everyone else. They were something more like a political and cultural system that absorbed many different ancient peoples, some of whom had lived in those mountains long before anyone called themselves Inca. This challenges a core part of the traditional story. The idea that the Inca were a distinct ethnic group who conquered lesser peoples starts to fall apart when the DNA shows deep, shared ancestry across the region for thousands of years. Some researchers now believe the Inca may have functioned less like a single nation and more like a massive alliance system, built on top of populations who were already deeply connected. If that is true, then the empire was never really about one group ruling others. It may have been about organizing something that was already there. Let that idea sit for a moment, because it changes everything that comes next. If you're starting to feel like history has been quietly rewriting itself in real time, stay with me. Because the next part is where the human side of this story becomes almost impossible to look away from. Here is where things get even more emotional. Scientists did not just study general population patterns. They studied individual remains, specific people, specific bones with specific stories. One of the most important discoveries came from studying human sacrifice victims, especially children, found at high-altitude sites in the Andes. These sacrifices were part of a ritual known as capacocha. Children, sometimes very young, were selected, sometimes from distant regions of the empire, and taken on a final journey to be offered in sacred ceremonies at mountain peaks. For a long time, historians assumed these children were mostly local Inca children, chosen from the ruling group's own bloodline as the highest form of sacrifice. But DNA changed that assumption. Genetic testing revealed that many of these children came from distant regions, not the core Inca homeland. Some carried genetic markers linking them to communities hundreds of miles away. This means something painful and important. The empire was not sacrificing its own children from the center of power. It was often taking children from conquered or allied regions and using them in rituals meant to represent unity, loyalty, or control over the empire. This detail matters deeply because it reveals something about how power actually worked in the Inca world. Sacrifice was not just religious. It was political. It was a message. It said, even your children belong to this system now. Imagine being a parent in a small mountain village, watching your child chosen for an honor that was really a demonstration of power you had no control over. This is where history stops being just facts and starts being human pain. And this discovery raises the next big question. If children from distant regions were being incorporated into the most sacred rituals of the empire, how connected were these regions really? Were they loyal citizens, controlled subjects, or something more complicated, caught between belief, fear, and survival? The DNA does not just tell us who the Inca were. It tells us what daily life inside that empire truly felt like for millions of ordinary people who were never named in any official record. And that leads us to another mystery that DNA has only recently begun to untangle. And what happened to the people after the Spanish conquest? This part of the story feels almost too tragic to imagine, but ancient DNA has revealed the truth in painful detail. The traditional story says European diseases, especially smallpox, devastated indigenous populations after contact with the Spanish. This is true, and it was catastrophic. Entire communities were wiped out in waves of illness that spread faster than anyone could stop. But genetic research added something deeper to this story. Scientists studying population genetics across South America found evidence of a massive population decline, not just from disease, but from a combination of disease, war, forced labor, and social collapse that reshaped the genetic landscape of the entire continent. Some regions show such a dramatic drop in genetic diversity that scientists describe it as one of the largest population collapses in human history. This is where the story stops being just about empires and starts being about human survival. Descendants of Inca populations did not disappear. They adapted, mixed, and survived in ways that still show up in the DNA of modern Andean communities today. Many people living in Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador carry genetic threads connecting them directly back to these ancient populations, sometimes stretching back thousands of years before the Inca Empire even existed. This means the story of the Inca is not a closed chapter from the past. It is a living thread, still present in real people, real families, real communities today. If you have ever wondered whether history really lives inside us, this is proof that it does. Before we go further into the deepest reveal of this story, take a moment and ask yourself something. If your ancestors' entire world could be erased from memory but still survive quietly in your blood, what do you think that would feel like to discover? Hold that thought, because the next part of this story goes even deeper into identity itself. Now here is where the story becomes almost unbelievable. For a long time, historians believed the ruling class of the Inca Empire, the elite, the royal bloodlines, the nobles, were genetically distinct from the common people they ruled. This matched the old idea of a small, powerful group dominating a much larger, separate population. But newer genetic studies have started challenging even this idea. Some researchers analyzing remains from elite burial sites found genetic patterns that were far more mixed than expected. Instead of a clearly separate royal bloodline, evidence suggests intermarriage, alliance building, and genetic blending between ruling families and powerful families from conquered or allied regions. This suggests something historians have long suspected but could never fully prove. The Inca Empire may have expanded not just through war, but through strategic marriage, alliance, and incorporation of powerful families from different regions into the ruling structure. In simple words, power was not just taken by force. It was often built through relationships, blood ties, and political marriage across different peoples. This challenges the simple hero and conqueror story we were taught. Instead, it reveals something more human, a complicated web of politics, family, loyalty, and power, similar to royal families anywhere else in history. This detail also connects to something even bigger. If elite bloodlines were mixed with conquered regions, then the very idea of a pure Inca ruling race becomes questionable. Some historians now argue that Inca identity was never really about blood at all. It was about political belonging, loyalty, and participation in a shared system, not ancestry. This idea completely reshapes how we should think about ancient empires in general. Maybe identity in the ancient world was never as simple as bloodline. Maybe it was about which system you belonged to, which language you spoke, which gods you honored, which roads you walked. If that is true, the Inca were not just a bloodline that conquered others. They were an idea, a structure, a system that different peoples joined, were absorbed into, or were forced to accept. This is where history stops feeling like a story about ancient people and starts feeling like a mirror for how power still works today. Let's talk about one more layer of this mystery, because this next discovery might be the most surprising of all. For centuries, scholars debated how the Inca managed to unify such a massive empire without a written language. The common belief was that the Inca relied entirely on an oral system, along with a complex system of knotted cords called quipu, used mainly for accounting and record keeping. But recent research suggests quipu may have carried far more complex information than previously believed, possibly even encoding language-like structures. Some researchers now believe these knotted cords may have held stories, histories, and messages we have not yet fully decoded. If this is true, it means the Inca were not a society without records. They were a society whose records we simply have not learned to read yet. Imagine that. Somewhere out there, tied into ancient knotted string, real human stories may be waiting, untranslated, silent, holding memories we have never heard. This is one of the biggest open mysteries in Inca history today. Historians still debate how much information quipu actually held. Some believe it was limited to numbers and basic categories. Others believe it may have held much deeper meaning, possibly even personal and historical records. Either way, this reveals something powerful. We are still uncovering pieces of this civilization, even now, in the modern world. If a quipu were ever fully decoded, revealing a personal message from someone who lived 500 years ago, what do you think it might say? Take a moment and imagine that. Now, let's bring all of these threads together, because this is where the real emotional weight of this story reveals itself. The Inca were not simply a small tribe that conquered a giant empire in 100 years through military power alone. They were part of a much older, deeply connected web of Andean peoples, some with roots stretching back thousands of years before the empire even existed. Their expansion likely involved a mix of warfare, alliance, marriage, and absorption of different cultures, not just domination. Their rituals, especially child sacrifice, reveal a system where power extended into the most personal and painful parts of human life, reaching into distant villages and taking their children as symbols of unity and control. Their ruling class may not have been a separate bloodline at all, but a blended, evolving network of powerful families from different regions. Their downfall was not simply about Spanish soldiers being brave or lucky. It was about disease, political division, forced labor, and a population collapse so severe it reshaped the genetic future of an entire continent. And their legacy did not vanish. It survives quietly, powerfully in the DNA of millions of people living across South America today. This is not just a story about an ancient civilization falling apart. This is a story about identity itself, about how power convinces people they belong to something bigger than themselves, about how conquest is rarely as simple as good versus evil, hero versus villain, about how history, when we finally use science to look closer, almost always turns out to be more complicated, more human, and more painful than the simple version we were taught. The Inca were not what we thought. They were something deeper, a civilization built not just on conquest, but on connection, complexity, memory, and survival. And maybe that is the most powerful truth hidden inside this ancient story. Empires do not survive because of stone roads or royal bloodlines. They survive because of the people underneath them, the ones history forgets to name, whose blood, whose memory, whose quiet endurance carries the real story forward long after the empire itself has fallen. If this story changed the way you see history, even a little, imagine how many other ancient truths are still buried, waiting quietly for someone to finally listen.